I was broke. Not just regular broke, but the kind of broke where you're counting quarters to buy ramen noodles and praying your landlord doesn't knock on your door. My last job ended 3 months ago when the company decided they didn't need a night security guard anymore. Apparently, cameras could do my job better than I could. So there I was, scrolling through job listings at 2 in the morning when I saw it. The posting was simple, almost too simple. Lighthouse caretaker needed. Remote location on Massachusetts coast. Must be comfortable with isolation. Excellent pay. Housing provided. Call Martha at 555-0147. The pay caught my attention first. $3,000 a month, plus free housing. For watching over some old lighthouse? It seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate enough not to care. I called the number the next morning. An elderly woman answered on the second ring. "Hello, this is Martha." Her voice had that thick New England accent, the kind you hear in old movies. She sounded like she'd lived by the ocean her whole life. "Hi, I'm calling about the lighthouse caretaker position." "Oh, wonderful. Tell me, young man, do you mind being alone for long periods?" "Not at all. I actually prefer it." "Good. This lighthouse is quite remote. The nearest town is 15 miles away, and the road isn't always reliable during storms. Can you handle that?" "Yes, ma'am. I don't have much tying me down here anyway." She asked a few more questions. Did I have experience with maintenance work? Could I follow specific instructions without questioning them? Was I available to start immediately? I answered yes to everything. I needed this job. "Excellent. The position is yours if you want it. I'll need you to start this weekend. The lighthouse is located on Beacon Point, just north of Marblehead. Do you know the area? I can find it. There's a small cottage attached to the lighthouse where you'll be staying. Everything you need is already there. Food, basic supplies, maintenance equipment. You'll find detailed instructions when you arrive." Something in her tone made me pause. Instructions? Oh yes, very important instructions. The lighthouse has been operating for over 100 years. There are certain procedures that must be followed. Special procedures. You'll understand when you get there. I wanted to ask more, but she was already giving me directions. The lighthouse was at the end of a dirt road, she said. Just follow the signs to Beacon Point and keep driving until you can't go any further. One more thing, she added before hanging up. When you arrive, you'll find a sealed envelope on the kitchen table. Read it immediately. The instructions inside are not suggestions. They are requirements. Follow them exactly. The line went dead before I could respond. I packed what little I owned into my old Honda and left Boston that Friday evening. The drive to Marblehead took about an hour, but finding Beacon Point took another hour of driving down increasingly narrow roads. The sun was setting as I finally spotted the lighthouse. It stood on a rocky cliff overlooking the Atlantic, its white tower stark against the darkening sky. The beam wasn't on yet, but I could see the massive lens at the top, catching the last rays of sunlight. The cottage was smaller than I'd expected, but it looked sturdy. It was attached to the base of the lighthouse by a covered walkway. The whole structure looked like it had been built to withstand serious storms. I parked next to the cottage and grabbed my bags. The ocean was louder here than I'd expected. The waves crashed against the rocks below with a constant rhythmic pounding that you could feel in your chest. The cottage door was unlocked. Inside, it was clean and well maintained. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1950, but it was comfortable. On the kitchen table, exactly where Martha had said it would be, was a manila envelope. My name was written on it, in careful handwriting. along with the words, "Rules read immediately." I set my bags down and stared at the envelope. Something about it made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way my name was written, like whoever wrote it knew more about me than they should. Or maybe it was just the isolation getting to me already. I made myself a cup of coffee first, using the supplies that were already there. Then I sat down at the table and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same careful handwriting. At the top, in larger letters, it said, "Lighthouse caretaker rules follow exactly." Below that was a list of instructions. Some of them seemed normal enough. Keep the lighthouse beam operational from sunset to sunrise. Check the generator twice daily. Report any maintenance issues to Martha immediately. But others were strange, really strange. I read through the list twice, then set it down and looked around the cottage. Through the window, I could see the lighthouse beam had turned on automatically. It swept across the dark ocean in a slow, steady rhythm. I picked up the list and read it again. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. Maybe Martha was just eccentric. Maybe the previous caretaker had been paranoid. Maybe the isolation of this place made people imagine things. I unpacked my clothes and made dinner from the canned goods in the pantry. Outside, the ocean continued its endless pounding against the rocks. The lighthouse beam swept across the water like a giant eye, searching for something in the darkness. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The sound of the waves was actually soothing, and the cottage was warm and comfortable. I woke up feeling optimistic about my new job. I had no idea what I was in for. I woke up the next morning to the sound of seagulls and crashing waves. The lighthouse beam had turned off automatically at sunrise, just like Martha had said it would. For a moment, I felt like I was living in a postcard. Then I remembered the envelope. I made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. The manila envelope was still there, seeming to stare at me. I pulled out the sheet of paper and read it properly for the first time. Lighthouse caretaker rules follow exactly. Rule number 1 seemed normal enough. Maintain lighthouse beam operation from sunset to sunrise daily. Check generator at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Rule 2 was also straightforward. Report any mechanical issues to Martha immediately. Do not attempt major repairs yourself. But then things got weird. Rule 3 said, never look directly at the lighthouse beam between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. If you must check the beacon during the hours, use the periscope in the equipment room. A periscope? I'd seen an equipment room attached to the lighthouse yesterday, but I hadn't noticed any periscope. And why couldn't I look at the beam during those specific hours? Rule 4 was even stranger. If you hear knocking from inside the lighthouse after midnight, do not investigate. The sounds will stop on their own. I stared at that one for a long time. Knocking from inside. The lighthouse was just a tower with stairs leading to the beacon room. What could possibly be knocking in there? Rule 5 made me laugh, but not in a good way. Keep the radio on channel 16 at all times. If the radio goes completely silent for more than 5 minutes, leave the cottage immediately and drive to town. Do not return until the next day. Channel 16 was the marine emergency frequency. I knew that much from watching Coast Guard documentaries. But why would I need to leave if it went silent? Rule 6 was about mirrors. Cover all mirrors in the cottage at sunset. Uncover them at sunrise. The black cloth is in the bedroom closet. I looked around the cottage. There were 3 mirrors that I could see. One in the bathroom, one in the bedroom, and a small one by the front door. Why would I need to cover mirrors? Rule 7 mentioned the basement. The basement door is located behind the lighthouse. It is locked. Do not open it under any circumstances. If you find it unlocked, call Martha immediately and leave the cottage. A basement behind the lighthouse? I hadn't seen any basement door yesterday, but I hadn't walked around the entire building either. Rule 8 was the most unsettling. You will not have any visitors during time here. If anyone approaches the cottage or lighthouse, they are not who they appear to be. Do not let them inside. Do not speak to them. The isolation was one thing, but this sounded like paranoia. What did it mean they weren't who they appeared to be? Rule 9 was short, but confusing. Do not use the telephone between midnight and 6 a.m. If it rings during these hours, let it ring. And finally, Rule 10. These rules exist for your safety and the safety of others. Previous caretakers who ignored them are no longer with us. I set the paper down and stared out the window at the ocean. The morning sun made everything look normal and peaceful. Fishing boats moved slowly across the horizon. A few seagulls fought over something on the rocks below. But those rules, they didn't make sense. They sounded like the kind of thing someone would write if they were losing their mind from isolation. I decided to explore the lighthouse properly. I walked through the covered walkway that connected the cottage to the lighthouse base. The door was heavy wood with old-fashioned iron hinges. It opened easily. Inside, the lighthouse was just what I expected, a circular room with stone walls and a spiral staircase leading up to the beacon room. There was nothing here that could knock, just stone and metal and the smell of salt air. I climbed the stairs to get a better look at the beacon itself. The lens was massive, probably 6 feet across. It was surrounded by mirrors and prisms that would focus and direct the light. Everything looked well maintained and modern, despite the lighthouse's age. Back downstairs, I found the equipment room. It was filled with spare parts, tools, and maintenance supplies. And there, mounted on the wall, was a periscope, an actual periscope, like something from a submarine. I looked through it and realized it gave a clear view of the beacon room above, so I could check the light without actually being up there. But why would I need to do that? I spent the rest of the morning exploring the area around the lighthouse. The building sat on a rocky outcrop that dropped straight down to the ocean on 3 sides. The only way in or out was the dirt road I'd driven in on. Walking around the back of the lighthouse, I found the basement door. It was set into the rock face, almost hidden by the natural stone. The door was thick wood, reinforced with iron bands, and it was locked with a heavy padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I tried to peer through the gaps around the door, but I couldn't see anything. There was a faint sound coming from inside, though, like water dripping, which made sense, I supposed, since we were right next to the ocean. That afternoon, I tested the radio. I turned it to channel 16 and listened to the normal chatter. Coast Guard communications, fishing boats checking in, weather reports, nothing unusual. As evening approached, I found myself thinking about the rules again. They seemed so specific, so detailed, like they'd been written by someone who'd experienced whatever they were warning about. I found the black cloth in the bedroom closet, just like the rules said. At sunset, I covered all 3 mirrors. It felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. The lighthouse beam came on automatically as darkness fell. I watched it sweep across the ocean from the cottage window. It was actually quite beautiful, this steady rhythm of light cutting through the darkness. I made dinner and tried to relax. The radio continued its normal marine chatter. No mysterious knocking from the lighthouse. no strange visitors, just the sound of waves and the occasional seagull. Maybe the rules were just the paranoid ramblings of a previous caretaker. Maybe Martha kept them as a joke or to test new employees. Maybe I was worrying about nothing. I went to bed around 11, feeling pretty good about my new job. The cottage was comfortable, the work seemed easy, and the pay was excellent. I could handle a few eccentric rules if it meant financial stability. I had no idea that in just a few hours, I'd understand exactly why those rules existed. And I'd wish I'd taken them more seriously. I woke up at 2:30 a.m. to the sound of something crashing outside. My first thought was that a tree had fallen, but there were no trees near the lighthouse, just rocks and grass and the endless ocean. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The lighthouse beam was sweeping across the water like always, its light cutting through the darkness in that steady rhythm. Everything looked normal. But I remembered Rule 3. Never look directly at the lighthouse beam between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I was already looking at it. As I watched, something moved in the light. Not a bird or a piece of debris. Something large and dark that seemed to swim through the beam itself. It was there for just a second, then gone. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The beam swept across the water, empty now, just light reflecting off the waves. I told myself it was probably a bat or a seagull caught in the light, but it hadn't moved like a bird. It had moved like something much bigger, something that belonged in the water, not the air. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The image of that dark shape kept playing in my mind. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination. First night in a new place, weird rules, isolated location. It was natural to see things that weren't there. But when I went to check the generator at 8 a.m., I found something that made me stop cold. There were wet footprints on the rocks outside the lighthouse. Not just wet, but soaking, like someone had just walked out of the ocean and climbed up onto the rocks. The footprints were human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too long, with spaces between the toes that were too wide. And they didn't dry up in the morning sun like normal water would. They stayed wet, like they were made of something thicker than seawater. I followed the footprints, but they just led to the edge of the rocks and stopped. Like whoever made them had walked straight back into the ocean. I spent the morning trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a fisherman who'd come ashore to check something. Maybe the weird shape was just how the prints looked on the uneven rock surface. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But the footprints bothered me all day. That afternoon, I decided to explore the cottage more thoroughly. In the bedroom closet, behind the black cloth for the mirrors, I found a cardboard box. Inside were old logbooks and journals. The logbooks were official lighthouse records going back decades. Most entries were routine. Light operational, generator running, weather conditions, ship sightings. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something strange. The handwriting changed every few months. Different caretakers, I assumed. But the entries from each caretaker followed the same pattern. They started normal, then became worried, then desperate, then stopped completely. One entry from 1987 caught my attention. Day 23. The rules make sense now. I should have listened from the beginning. The things in the water aren't just fish. They're waiting for something. The beam calls to them. Another entry from 1994. Day 45. I broke Rule 3 last night. I saw them swimming in the light. They saw me too. I think they're getting closer to shore. And one from 2003. Day 12. I tried to leave yesterday, but the car wouldn't start. The radio went silent for 10 minutes. I hid in the basement until morning. I found bones down there. Old bones. I set the logbooks aside and picked up the journals. These were personal accounts, written by different caretakers over the years. The handwriting was different in each one, but the stories were similar. They all mentioned the rules. They all mentioned breaking them. And they all mentioned things that didn't make sense. One journal entry from 2010 stood out. Martha isn't who I thought she was. I called the number she gave me, but it's disconnected. I drove to the address she listed, but there's no house there. Just an empty lot with a foundation from a house that burned down in 1962. I dropped the journal and grabbed my phone. I called the number Martha had given me. It rang once, then went to a recording. The number you have dialed is not in service. My hands were shaking as I dialed again. Same recording. I ran to my car and checked the glove compartment where I'd written down Martha's address. According to my GPS, it was about 30 miles inland. I decided to drive there. The address led me to a residential neighborhood in Salem, but when I found the street number, there was no house, just an empty lot with old stone foundations poking up through the weeds. I asked a neighbor about it. She was an elderly woman working in her garden. Oh, that lot. There hasn't been a house there for decades. The old place burned down in the 60s. Some woman named Martha lived there alone. Crazy old thing. Always talking about the lighthouse and the things in the water. She died in the fire. My blood went cold. What did you say her name was? Martha. Martha Blackwood. Poor woman. They say she went mad from living alone at that lighthouse for so many years. Always claimed the ocean was full of things that weren't supposed to be there. I drove back to the lighthouse in a daze. The woman who'd hired me was dead, had been dead for over 60 years, so who had I talked to on the phone? Back at the cottage, I tried to think rationally. Maybe there was another Martha. Maybe the neighbor was confused. Maybe I'd misunderstood something. But as evening approached, I found myself thinking about the rules again, specifically about the radio rule. Keep it on channel 16 at all times. If it goes silent for more than 5 minutes, leave immediately. I turned on the radio. The usual marine chatter filled the cottage. Coast Guard communications, fishing boats, weather reports, normal sounds from the normal world. Then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., the radio went silent. Not just quiet, completely silent. No static, no background noise, nothing. Like someone had turned off every radio transmission in the world. I stared at the radio for 5 minutes, then 10. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. According to the rules, I should leave, drive to town and not come back until the next day. But I'd already broken Rule 3. I'd already seen something in the lighthouse beam, and I was starting to understand that the rules weren't suggestions. They were warnings. As I sat there in the silent cottage, listening to nothing, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Knocking. Slow, deliberate knocking coming from inside the lighthouse. Rule 4 said not to investigate. Rule 4 said the sounds would stop on their own. But the knocking continued. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Someone, or something, was inside the lighthouse, and they wanted me to know they were there. The knocking continued. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. It was coming from inside the lighthouse, echoing off the stone walls. I sat in the cottage kitchen, staring at the radio that had gone completely silent. The rules were clear. If the radio went silent, leave immediately. If I heard knocking from the lighthouse, don't investigate. But I couldn't move. Something about the knocking pattern felt deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate. After 20 minutes, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound itself. At least the knocking meant something was there. The silence meant I was alone with whatever had been making the noise. I waited another hour, but the radio stayed dead. Finally, I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door. I was going to follow the rules. I was going to drive to town and wait until morning. But when I got to my car, it wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but nothing happened. The battery was fine, the tank was full, but the car was dead. I was trapped. I walked back to the cottage, my heart pounding. The lighthouse beam swept across the water like always, but now it felt different, threatening, like it was searching for something. I tried the radio again. Still nothing. Not even static. That's when I remembered the journals. One of them had mentioned trying to leave but being unable to. The car wouldn't start. The radio went silent, and the caretaker had hidden in the basement until morning. But the rules said never to open the basement door. So where had that caretaker really hidden? I spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. The ocean waves sounded different now, angrier, like something was stirring beneath the surface. Morning came eventually, and with it, the radio crackled back to life. Normal marine chatter filled the cottage again. Coast Guard communications, fishing boats, weather reports. The world had returned to normal. My car started on the first try. I drove into town that morning, partly to get supplies and partly to see other human beings. The closest town was Marblehead, and it was busy with tourists and fishermen, normal people living normal lives. I stopped at the library and asked about the lighthouse. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, pulled out several books on local maritime history. Beacon Point Light, she said, flipping through the pages. Built in 1887 after a series of terrible shipwrecks. The waters around there are treacherous, lots of underwater rocks and strange currents. She showed me a map of the area. The ocean floor around the lighthouse was marked with dozens of shipwreck symbols, more than I'd ever seen in one area. That's a lot of wrecks, I said. The worst was in 1902. A passenger ship called the Minerva went down in a storm. Over 200 people died. They say the captain was following the lighthouse beam, but it led him straight into the rocks. She turned the page and showed me a newspaper clipping from 1902. The headline read, "Lighthouse Keeper Vanishes After Minerva Disaster." The keeper's name was Thomas Blackwood. He disappeared the night after the wreck. Some people thought he was overcome with guilt. Others said he was murdered by angry families who lost loved ones. Blackwood, like Martha Blackwood, the woman who'd hired me, the woman who'd died in 1962. Was Thomas related to a Martha Blackwood? I asked. The librarian looked surprised. Martha was his daughter. She took over as lighthouse keeper after he disappeared. Worked there for almost 40 years until she died in a house fire. Poor woman was never quite right after losing her father. I thanked her and left the library with copies of the historical records. Back at the lighthouse, I spread them out on the kitchen table and read through everything. The pattern was clear. The lighthouse had been built after shipwrecks. The keeper had vanished after the worst wreck in its history. His daughter had taken over and worked there until she died, and now, somehow, she was still hiring new caretakers. That evening, I decided to investigate the lighthouse properly. I'd been afraid before, but now I was angry. Something was playing games with me, and I wanted to know what. I climbed the spiral staircase to the beacon room. The massive lens rotated slowly, sending its beam across the dark ocean. Everything looked normal and mechanical. But as I watched, I noticed something odd. The beam wasn't pointing where it should be. According to the nautical charts I'd found, The lighthouse should guide ships safely around the underwater rocks. But the beam was pointing directly at the largest cluster of rocks. It was pointing ships toward danger, not away from it. I climbed down to the equipment room and found the controls for the lighthouse beam. The system was old but well maintained. There was a manual override that would let me redirect the beam to its proper position. As I reached for the controls, I heard it again. The knocking. This time it was coming from below me, not from the lighthouse stairs, but from somewhere beneath the lighthouse itself, from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The basement door was still locked, but as I approached, I could hear the knocking clearly. It was coming from inside the basement, echoing up through the stone. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks, pause. I pressed my ear to the door. Along with the knocking, I could hear something else. Water. Not dripping, but moving, like waves lapping against stone. But that was impossible. The basement was built into solid rock, well above the high tide line. I walked around to the other side of the lighthouse and found something I'd missed before. A small window, set low in the stone wall. It was covered with iron bars, but I could see through them. The basement wasn't empty. It was flooded, not with seawater, but with something darker, something that moved wrong, like it was thicker than water. And in that dark liquid, things were moving, pale shapes that looked almost human, but weren't quite right. They moved like they were swimming, but they were inside a basement that should have been dry. As I watched, one of the shapes came closer to the window. It pressed against the iron bars, and I saw its face. It had been human once, but the eyes were gone, replaced by dark holes. The skin was pale and bloated, like something that had been underwater for too long, and when it opened its mouth, I saw rows of sharp teeth that belonged in the ocean, not in a human face. The thing saw me watching. It raised one waterlogged hand and knocked on the iron bars. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. The basement was full of things that had once been human, things that had drowned in the waters around the lighthouse. And they were trying to get out. I ran back to the cottage and grabbed the list of rules. I read them again, understanding now what they really meant. They weren't just rules for keeping the lighthouse operational. They were rules for keeping the drowned ones contained. And I'd already broken half of them. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face pressed against the iron bars, those empty eye sockets, those rows of sharp teeth. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a hallucination. Stress, isolation, too much reading about shipwrecks. My mind was playing tricks on me. But when I went to check the generator at 8 a.m., I found the basement door standing wide open. The heavy padlock lay on the ground, broken, not cut or picked, but shattered from the inside, like something had hit it with tremendous force. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight ready. The smell hit me first, salt water and decay, like low tide mixed with something that had been dead for a long time. The stairs leading down were carved from solid rock. They disappeared into darkness, but I could hear water lapping against stone somewhere below. I should have called Martha. That's what Rule 7 said. If the basement door was unlocked, call Martha immediately and leave the cottage. But Martha was dead, had been dead for 60 years. I started down the stairs. The beam of my flashlight revealed stone walls covered in what looked like barnacles and seaweed. The air got colder with each step, and the smell of decay grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a large chamber carved from the bedrock. The floor was flooded with about 3 feet of dark water that didn't look or smell like seawater, but it wasn't empty water. Things moved beneath the surface, pale shapes that drifted like they were sleeping. Some looked human-sized, others were smaller, like children. All of them had that same waterlogged appearance I'd seen through the window. I counted at least 20 of them floating in the murky water, maybe more. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. Along the walls, I found shelves carved into the rock. They were covered with personal belongings, wallets, jewelry, pieces of clothing, all old, all water damaged. I picked up a leather wallet. Inside was a driver's license from 1987. The photo showed a young man with a friendly smile. The name was David Chen. Another wallet contained a license from 1994, Sarah Martinez. I recognized the name from one of the journal entries I'd read. These weren't just random drowning victims. These were the previous caretakers. I backed toward the stairs, but something splashed behind me. One of the floating shapes had moved. It was rising to the surface, water streaming from its pale skin. I ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door behind me. My hands shook as I tried to figure out how to lock it again, but the padlock was destroyed. Back in the cottage, I grabbed the journals and read through them again. Now they made horrible sense. David Chen's journal from 1987. Day 30. I understand now. The lighthouse doesn't guide ships safely. It calls them to the rocks. And when they sink, the drowned ones join the others in the basement. Martha says it's been happening since the lighthouse was built. She says it's necessary. Sarah Martinez's journal from 1994. Day 18. I tried to redirect the lighthouse beam, but it moves back on its own. Martha explained that the drowned ones feed on the energy from new victims. If they don't get fresh souls, they'll break free from the basement. The caretaker's job is to make sure they're fed. Another entry from 2003. Day 8. I can't do this anymore. I won't be responsible for leading ships to their death. But when I tried to leave, my car wouldn't start. The phone lines were dead. Martha says no one leaves until their replacement arrives. She says the drowned ones won't let us go. The final entry in that journal was different. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Day 45. I found a way out. If I join them willingly, they'll stop calling ships to the rocks, at least for a while, until the next caretaker arrives. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I set the journal down with trembling hands. The previous caretakers hadn't quit or been fired. They'd been fed to the things in the basement. And now it was my turn. I tried my phone. No signal. I tried the landline. Dead. I ran to my car and turned the key. Nothing. I was trapped, just like all the others. That evening, I sat in the cottage and watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. In the distance, I could see the lights of a fishing boat heading toward shore. The beam was pointing directly at the rocks. I ran to the lighthouse and climbed to the beacon room. The controls were there just like before. I could redirect the beam. I could save that boat. But as I reached for the controls, I heard splashing from below. The basement door was open again, and something was climbing the stairs. I used the periscope to look down. 3 of the drowned ones were in the lighthouse, moving slowly but steadily toward the beacon room. Their pale skin gleamed in the dim light, and dark water dripped from their clothes. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to stop me from changing the beam. I redirected the lighthouse beam anyway. The fishing boat altered course, heading safely around the rocks toward the harbor. The drowned ones stopped moving. They stood perfectly still on the stairs, their empty eye sockets turned toward me. Then slowly they began to move again, not toward the beacon room, but back toward the basement. I'd saved the fishing boat, but I had a terrible feeling I'd made things worse for myself. Back in the cottage, I found a new journal on the kitchen table. It was bound in water-stained leather, and the pages were damp to the touch. On the cover, written in fading ink, was my name. Inside, the first entry was already written, in handwriting that looked like mine, but felt wrong somehow. Day 1. I understand now why the previous caretakers couldn't leave. The lighthouse feeds on death, and the drowned ones are its servants. Each time a ship is saved, the debt grows larger. Each time the beam is redirected, they grow hungrier. The only way to satisfy them is to give them what they want: fresh souls, or the soul of the caretaker. I hadn't written those words. I'd never seen this journal before. But there it was, in my handwriting, describing things I was only beginning to understand. I flipped through the pages. They were all blank, waiting for me to fill them, waiting for me to document my slow descent into madness and desperation, just like all the caretakers before me. Outside, the lighthouse beam had returned to its original position. It was pointing at the rocks again, waiting for the next ship to come close enough to be led to its doom. And in the basement, the drowned ones were waiting too. They were patient. They'd been waiting for over a century. They could wait a little longer. The storm hit on my 10th night at the lighthouse. I'd been watching the weather reports on radio, but this came out of nowhere. One minute the ocean was calm, the next it was a churning mass of black water and foam. The wind howled around the cottage, rattling the windows and doors. Rain hammered against the roof like bullets. The lighthouse beam cut through the darkness, but it seemed dimmer somehow, struggling against the storm. I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to ignore the supernatural journal that kept appearing and disappearing from the table, when I saw the first figure. It was walking along the rocky shore, moving slowly toward the lighthouse. At first, I thought it was just debris blown by the wind, but as it got closer, I could see it was a person. A man in what looked like an old-fashioned naval uniform. He was soaking wet, his clothes clinging to his body. He moved with the strange, jerky gait of someone who wasn't quite used to walking on land. Rule 8 came back to me. You will not have any visitors during your time here. If anyone approaches the cottage or lighthouse, they are not who they appear to be. Do not let them inside. Do not speak to them. The man reached the cottage and stopped outside the front door. He stood there for a long moment, water dripping from his uniform. Then he raised his hand and knocked. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. The knocking continued for several minutes, then stopped. Through the window, I watched the man walk away from the cottage toward the lighthouse, but he didn't disappear. Instead, he stood at the base of the lighthouse and pointed up toward the beacon room. Then he turned and pointed out toward the ocean. More figures appeared from the storm. Men, women, even children, all of them wearing old-fashioned clothes, all of them soaking wet. They gathered around the lighthouse, pointing at the beacon and then at the sea. I counted at least 30 of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell in the storm and darkness. They didn't try to enter the lighthouse or the cottage. They just stood there, pointing and waiting, like they were trying to tell me something. I watched them for hours. They never moved from their positions, never stopped pointing. Rain passed right through them without effect. The wind didn't disturb their clothes. As dawn approached, they began to fade, not walking away, but actually becoming transparent. By the time the sun came up, they were gone, but they'd left something behind. Footprints in the mud around the lighthouse, dozens of them, all leading from the ocean to the lighthouse and back again. and they were the same strange footprints I'd seen on my first morning. Too long, with spaces between the toes that were too wide. I spent the day researching the lighthouse's history more thoroughly. I drove to the county courthouse and searched through old records, ship manifests, death certificates, newspaper articles. The pattern was clear and horrifying. The Minerva had gone down in 1902 with 247 passengers and crew. All lost. The lighthouse beam had been the last thing they'd seen before hitting the rocks. But it wasn't the only ship. Every few years, another vessel would follow the lighthouse beam to disaster. The Lady Catherine in 1911, the Boston Queen in 1923, the Faithful Sarah in 1936. Each time, the official reports blamed the captain or bad weather or mechanical failure. But the survivor accounts, when there were any, all mentioned the same thing. They'd been following the lighthouse beam to safety when it led them into the rocks. I found death certificates for hundreds of people over the decades, all drowned in the waters around Beacon Point, all during storms when the lighthouse beam would have been their only guide. That evening, I sat in the cottage and thought about what I'd learned. The lighthouse wasn't just calling ships to their doom randomly. It was doing it deliberately, systematically. And the drowned ones weren't just victims. They were part of the system. The visitors from the storm weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to warn me. They were the souls of everyone who died in those waters, and they wanted me to understand what the lighthouse really was. At sunset, I covered the mirrors like the rules said. But this time, I caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror before I covered it. Martha Blackwood was standing behind me. Not the elderly woman I'd imagined from her voice on the phone. This was a younger Martha, maybe 40 years old. Her hair was gray and her eyes were sad, but she looked completely solid and real. I spun around, but no one was there. When I looked back at the mirror, it was just my own reflection staring back. I covered the mirror with the black cloth and went to the kitchen. The supernatural journal was on the table again. A new entry had appeared. Day 10. The visitors came during the storm. They're trying to help, but they can't interfere directly. The lighthouse has rules that even the dead must follow. They can only point and hope the caretaker understands. Previous caretakers never did. They were too scared to listen. I hadn't written that entry, but it was in my handwriting, just like before. I picked up a pen and wrote my own entry below it. Day 10. I saw Martha in the mirror. She's still here, isn't she? She's been here all along hiring new caretakers. But why? What does she want? I set the pen down and watched. Slowly, new words appeared on the page. She wants to stop it. The lighthouse was corrupted after her father disappeared. Something evil took control of it. Martha has been trying to find a caretaker brave enough to break the cycle. All the others gave up or joined the drowned ones. You're different. You saved the fishing boat. You're fighting back. I stared at the words. How do I stop it? More words appeared. The source is in the beacon room. Something that doesn't belong there. Something that's been controlling the lighthouse since 1902. But getting to it means going through the drowned ones. And they're getting stronger. As if summoned by the words, I heard splashing from outside. The basement door was open again, and the drowned ones were emerging. Not just 3 or 4 this time, but dozens of them. They weren't heading for the lighthouse. They were surrounding the cottage. I looked out the window and saw them standing in the rain, their pale faces turned toward me. They'd been patient for 10 days, waiting to see what I would do. But my attempt to save the fishing boat had changed things. I'd shown them I was willing to fight. And now they were going to stop me. before I could cause any more trouble. The siege of the cottage had begun. The drowned ones stood motionless around the cottage all night. They didn't try to break in or attack. They just watched, waiting. I stayed awake, moving from window to window, counting them. At least 40 pale figures surrounding the cottage. Some I recognized from the basement. Others looked like they'd been underwater much longer. When dawn came, they didn't fade away like the storm visitors had. They remained in place, a silent army of the dead. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. The landline was dead. My car wouldn't start. I was completely cut off from the outside world, but the supernatural journal was still working. New entries kept appearing throughout the morning. Day 11. The drowned ones are afraid. You're the first caretaker to save a ship in over 50 years. They know you're different. They know you might actually succeed. The thing controlling the lighthouse isn't from this world. It came from the deep ocean in 1902, the same night the Minerva sank. It feeds on death and despair. The more people who die, the stronger it becomes. Thomas Blackwood tried to stop it. That's why he disappeared. The entity consumed him, but his death created a weakness. His daughter Martha has been exploiting that weakness ever since. I wrote back in the journal. What kind of weakness? The response appeared quickly. The lighthouse was built on sacred ground. The local tribe warned against it, but nobody listened. The entity can only control the lighthouse, not the land itself. But it needs willing servants to maintain its power. That's why it needs caretakers. How do I stop it? The entity lives in the beacon room. It's disguised as part of the lighthouse mechanism, but it's not. Look for something that doesn't belong, something that wasn't there when the lighthouse was built. But be careful. The drowned ones will do anything to protect it. I spent the day studying the lighthouse's original blueprints, which I'd found in the historical records. The beacon room was supposed to contain only the lens assembly, the rotating mechanism, and the light source. Nothing else. But when I'd been up there, I'd seen something extra. A small brass object, mounted near the lens. I'd assumed it was part of the original equipment, but now I wasn't sure. That evening, as the sun set, I made my decision. I was going to the beacon room. The drowned ones seemed to sense my intention. As I approached the lighthouse door, they began to move, not attacking, but positioning themselves between me and the lighthouse. I stopped and spoke to them directly, breaking Rule 8 for the first time. I know what you are. I know what happened to you. But I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to stop the thing that killed you. They didn't respond, but they didn't attack either. You were all caretakers, weren't you? You all tried to fight it. You all failed. But maybe together, we can succeed. One of them stepped forward. It was David Chen, the caretaker from 1987. His face was pale and bloated, but his eyes still held a spark of humanity. He pointed at the lighthouse, then at himself, then at me. Then he shook his head sadly. You're trying to warn me, I said. You're saying I'll end up like you. He nodded. But what if I don't give up? What if I keep fighting even after I die? David looked confused. Then hope flickered in his dead eyes. I walked toward the lighthouse. The drowned ones parted to let me pass, but they followed close behind. They were still trying to protect the entity, but part of them wanted me to succeed. Inside the lighthouse, I climbed the spiral stairs to the beacon room. The massive lens rotated slowly, sending its beam across the dark ocean. Everything looked normal, except for the brass object mounted near the lens. It was about the size of a dinner plate, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The metal seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking straight at it, and it was warm, much warmer than the cool ocean air. This was it, the source of the lighthouse's corruption. As I reached for it, the temperature in the beacon room dropped 20 degrees. The brass object began to glow with a sickly green light. Then I heard the voice. It didn't come from the object or from anywhere in the room. It came from inside my head, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. You cannot stop what has already begun. The ocean remembers every death. Every soul that is drowned in these waters belongs to me now. The voice was ancient and cold, like the deep ocean itself. It promised death and darkness and eternal servitude. The lighthouse is my beacon. It calls the living to join the dead. Your predecessors understood this eventually. They accepted their fate. You will too. I grabbed the brass object with both hands. It was burning hot, but I held on. The metal felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. I'm not like the others, I said aloud. I'm not giving up. The entity's laughter filled my mind. You think you're the first to try? Thomas Blackwood tried. He died screaming. Martha Blackwood tried. She went mad. All the caretakers tried. They all failed. But they tried alone, I said. I'm not alone. The drowned ones had climbed the stairs. They filled the beacon room, their pale faces turned toward me. David Chen stepped forward and placed his cold, wet hand on mine. One by one, the other drowned ones did the same. Sarah Martinez, the caretaker from 2003, dozens of others whose names I'd never learned, all of them touching the brass object, all of them fighting against the entity that had enslaved them. The object began to crack. Green light leaked from the fissures, and the entity's voice became a shriek of rage. You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. I am the hunger of the deep. You're a parasite, I said, and we're cutting you out. The brass object shattered. Green light exploded through the beacon room, and the entity's scream shook the entire lighthouse. Then suddenly, silence. The drowned ones looked at each other in wonder. Color was returning to their pale faces. The water was draining from their clothes. David Chen smiled at me. His eyes were clear and human again. Thank you, he said. His voice was hoarse but real. We've been trapped for so long. One by one, the drowned ones began to fade, not disappearing, but moving on, going to whatever comes after death, going to the peace they'd been denied for so long. What about the lighthouse? I asked David before he faded completely. It's free now, he said. It can do what it was meant to do, guide ships safely to shore. He was gone, and I was alone in the beacon room. The lighthouse beam continued to rotate, but now it was pointing where it should be, away from the rocks, toward the safe harbor. I climbed down the stairs and walked back to the cottage. The supernatural journal was on the table, but it was blank now, just empty pages waiting for normal entries. I picked up a pen and wrote, Day 11. The entity is destroyed. The lighthouse is free. The drowned ones are at peace. I think I can finally get some sleep. Outside, the ocean was calm. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, guiding ships safely home. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt like I could breathe. I woke up the next morning to the sound of seagulls and normal ocean waves. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, the sounds felt peaceful instead of threatening. The lighthouse beam had turned off automatically at sunrise, just like it was supposed to. My phone had signal again. The landline was working. When I tried my car, it started immediately. I was free to leave. But as I sat in the cottage kitchen, drinking coffee and watching fishing boats move safely past the rocks, I realized something important. The lighthouse still needed a caretaker. The entity was gone, but the lighthouse was over a century old. It needed maintenance, monitoring, someone to make sure it kept working properly. Ships still depended on it for safe passage. I called the Coast Guard to report that the lighthouse was operational and under proper management. I called the electric company to set up the utility bills in my name. I called Martha's old number, expecting it to be disconnected. But this time, someone answered. Hello? It was Martha's voice, but different, younger, less tired. Martha, this is the caretaker at Beacon Point Light. Oh, wonderful. I was hoping you'd call. I've been so worried. How are things going? I paused, not sure how to answer. The lighthouse is working properly now. The entity is gone. I know, dear. I felt it when it happened. You did something amazing. You saved all those trapped souls. Are you really Martha Blackwood? The same Martha who hired me? She laughed, and it was a sound full of genuine joy. I'm Martha's spirit, yes. I've been tied to this place since I died, trying to find someone who could break the cycle. You did it. You set them free. What happens now? Now you have a choice. You can leave and live your normal life. The lighthouse will run automatically for a while, but eventually it will need a new caretaker, someone who doesn't know its history. Or you can stay. Keep the lighthouse running properly. Make sure it guides ships safely instead of leading them to destruction. It's important work, but it's also lonely work. I looked around the cottage. It was small but comfortable. The isolation that had seemed threatening before now felt peaceful, and there was something satisfying about maintaining the lighthouse, keeping it working for the ships that depended on it. If I stay, what about the rules? There are no rules now, just normal lighthouse maintenance. The mirrors don't need to be covered. The radio doesn't need to stay on channel 16. You won't have any supernatural visitors. What about you? Will you still be here? I don't know. I might move on now that my work is done, or I might stay to help you adjust. We'll see. I spent the day thinking about the choice. I could go back to Boston, look for another job, return to my old life. But what was waiting for me there? A cramped apartment, unemployment, no real purpose. Here, I had meaningful work. I had a comfortable home. I had the ocean and the lighthouse, and the satisfaction of knowing I was helping people stay safe. That evening, I sat on the rocks outside the lighthouse and watched the sun set. The beacon came on automatically, sweeping its beam across the water, but this time, the light was warm and welcoming. It guided a small fishing boat safely around the rocks toward the harbor. I had made my decision. The next morning, I drove to town and bought supplies. Real food, not just canned goods. Books to read during the long winter nights. Tools for maintaining the lighthouse properly. I called my old landlord and told him I wouldn't be coming back. I called the few friends I had and let them know I'd found a permanent job. Then I drove back to the lighthouse and settled in for the long haul. The work was routine but satisfying. I checked the beacon every day, maintained the generator, kept detailed logs of weather conditions and ship traffic. I learned about the lighthouse's mechanical systems and how to repair them. Martha's spirit visited occasionally, offering advice and company. She seemed more at peace now, no longer burdened by decades of guilt over the ships that had been led to their doom. Sometimes on clear nights, I could see the spirits of the drowned ones in the distance, but they weren't trapped anymore. They were free, watching over the waters they died in, making sure no other ships would suffer the same fate. The basement dried out completely. I turned it into a workshop where I could maintain the lighthouse equipment. There were no more supernatural visitors, no more mysterious rules, No more voices in my head. Just me, the lighthouse, and the endless ocean. Months passed, then a year. I grew comfortable with the routine, the isolation, the responsibility. I learned to read the weather patterns, to predict when ships would need extra guidance, to spot problems with the lighthouse before they became serious. I also learned something else. The job posting had appeared in newspapers again. Not because something supernatural was calling for new victims, but because the Coast Guard was looking for a backup caretaker, someone to help during storms or when I needed time off. I interviewed the applicants myself this time. I chose a young woman named Sarah who reminded me of myself when I'd first arrived, desperate for work, willing to take risks but also fundamentally decent. I trained her properly. I showed her how everything worked, how to maintain the equipment, how to read the weather. I told her the lighthouse's history, but I also made sure she understood that the dangerous part was over. "What about the rules?" she asked, pointing to the old list that I'd kept framed on the wall as a reminder. "There are new rules now," I said. "Simple ones. Keep the light working, help ships navigate safely, take care of the lighthouse." "That's it?" "That's it. The rest is just normal lighthouse maintenance." She looked relieved. "And you'll be here to help if I need it?" "I'll be here," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." As I write this, it's been 5 years since I first arrived at Beacon Point Light. Sarah has become a skilled caretaker in her own right. Martha's spirit visits less frequently now, but when she does, she seems happy. The lighthouse guides dozens of ships safely past the rocks every month. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd left after destroying the entity. Would someone else have taken care of the lighthouse? Would ships have been safe? But I don't regret my choice. This is good work, meaningful work. Every ship that passes safely in the night is a reminder that some things are worth dedicating your life to. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water as I finish writing this entry. Not in a supernatural journal that writes itself, but in a normal logbook that will help future caretakers understand their responsibilities. Tomorrow, Sarah and I will check the generator, clean the lens, and make sure everything is working properly. We'll monitor the weather reports and watch for ships that need guidance. It's a simple life, but it's a good life. And for the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.